Now that we're all skilled up on functions with inputs, we're finally ready to complete our xylophone app. Given that we've just learned all about function parameters and function arguments, I'd like to start this lesson with a challenge. Can you modify the play sound function so that it can take a string input, so an input of the data type string, and it's going to be called sound name, and then use that input instead of this hard-coded C letter. And finally, pass over this sender.currentTitle when you call the play sound function, so that when you press any of the keys, it will play the corresponding sound. So pause the video and try to complete that challenge. All right, so first things first, let's add an input to this function play sound. Let's modify it. And we said that we were going to call the input sound name. And then we were going to give it the data type of a string. So now that we've modified our function, we can now use this sound name inside our function. And we're going to use it to replace this resource name. So instead of using just C every time we want to play a sound, we're going to use that sound name that gets passed in. And that could be any one of the titles of our buttons. So now when I play sound, I'm going to pass over the sound name. Notice how it's telling me that I'm now missing an argument for the parameter sound name. And if I click on it, I can say fix. So now it adds the parameter name, which is what we specified here, and it's expecting a value. Now that value is not going to be something I'm going to simply type out, D or C. Instead, it's going to be based on what the sender.currentTitle is. So I'm going to cut it from there and paste it in here. And then I'm going to delete my print statement. Now, the final thing that we actually have to do is we have to click on this and simply click fix on one of these options. Now, the one that I'm going to choose is an exclamation mark. And the reason why we need it and why we get that error is because the sender.currentTitle has a data type that is something that we would call an optional string. So the optional comes from that question mark. And it's because that we could have a button whose title is actually nil. It doesn't exist. In which case we would be playing around with some non-existent value and we'd be trying to pass it over to our play sound function, and then we would try to play a non-existent value, and then our app will just come tumbling down. So the reason why this is an optional and it forces you to put in an exclamation mark is because it forces you to check and think, is there a situation where one of my buttons might not have a title? And we can see that out of all of the buttons that's linked to our IB action, they all have a title. So there's really no case where this can fail. So we can safely add an exclamation mark to say, don't worry, we've checked. It's always going to have a title. So we'll just send it over as the input to our play sound function. So now if I click on the C button, sender.currentTitle will be equal to C, and then C becomes the sound name and C gets put in here. So then it plays C.wave, and it will change that depending on which button I press. So now let's run our app. And if I go ahead and click, notice how every single key now has a different sound. And we've now completed our xylophone app using a bit of knowledge about Stack Overflow, about Google Search, as well as the Apple documentation for iOS programming. So run your app and play the xylophone to your heart's content. And once you're done, we're going to tackle a boss challenge.